Okay, great. Let's get started. So, my name is Daisy Dunn. I'm a special correspondent at the climate publication Carbon Brief. And thanks for joining me today for the launch of the Power Shift report, Why We Need to Wean Our Industrial Food Systems of Fossil Fuels. So, we have about an hour today. We're going to hear some introductory remarks, an overview of the report's findings. We're going to move on to a moderated panel discussion with some panelists from across the world. And then we're going to have an audience Q&A. So please, if you have a question at any time, use the chat box function, the Q&A function to submit your questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on them. We're also going to have a few polls throughout the webinar to gather your thoughts. So you should be able to vote on those, and then I'll be able to reveal the results. We'll discuss them. Just to note as well, there is interpretation available in French and Spanish. So you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to select your preferred language. This webinar is going to be recorded in English, French, and Spanish, and we'll share a link after the event. I'll now turn over to Patty to give some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm Patty Fong, Program Director for Climate and Health and Wellbeing at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. As a strategic alliance of philanthropic foundations, we're committed to transforming global food systems for greater health, sustainability, and equity. Our approach involves forging new insights and convening key stakeholders to incite action for food systems transformation. Today's webinar aims to share with you our recently launched report, Power Shift, Why We Need to Wean Our Industrial Food Systems Off Fossil Fuels, and is an example of our work towards this objective. More and more funders, civil society advocates, and policymakers understand the importance of food systems transformation and the energy transition. However, these discussions too often occur in isolated silos, in part because people don't understand how interconnected food and energy systems really are. So we commissioned this report to help identify this nexus, to detail the trade-offs, synergies, gaps, and opportunities within the food and energy nexus, and provide recommendations for collaboration amongst funders, policymakers, and advocates. This report represents the first ever estimation of global fossil fuel use across the entire food supply chain, from farm to plate. It adds to the evidence that we must urgently wean our food systems alongside other economic sectors off fossil fuels and shift towards local, sustainable, and people-centered food systems. We're particularly underscoring the nexus in advance of COP28. With the petrostate host, we're concerned that the presidency's focus on food systems could be a tactic to distract from action on fossil fuels. While we welcome discussions on food and agriculture, at COP28, there's a lack of attention on phasing out fossil fuels. So our objective is to really fill this gap and underscore the need for a comprehensive approach that addresses the challenges in both the food and energy sectors. Now, back to today's webinar, we're excited to share with you the detailed analysis presented by our colleagues at Dalberg and hear insights from our distinguished panel. This is the first of two webinars arranged to accommodate various time zones so that we can dive deeper into how food and energy are connected in different parts of the world. Our goal from the discussion today is to identify practical opportunities for positive actions and collaboration amongst different stakeholders involved in the global food and energy landscape. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your active participation. Back to you, Daisy.
Thank you very much for those remarks. So we're now coming to the first of today's polls. I'm told the poll should appear on the screen in front of you. Oh yeah, I can see it myself now. So the question is, what aspect of the food energy nexus are you working on? And you can see there's various options there. Campaigns on agrochemicals, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, biofuels and biogas, renewable energy, healthy and sustainable diets, corporate consolidation and influence, other, and then none. So I'll just give a few seconds for people to give their answers in, and then the answers should display on the screen and we can look at them. Okay, great. I can see them now. I hope everyone else can too. So I can see that 39% of people are working in agroecology and regenerative agriculture, 30% in helping sustainable diets, and then still a good number of people working in the other areas. So that's great. We'll move on now. So we're going to move on to the presentation of the report. So we're going to hear from Tiara Lee, who is a consultant with Dalberg Advisors, a social impact consultancy based out of Hong Kong, and the lead writer for the Power Shift report. So over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Daisy. And thank you for the introduction. I'll be taking us through the findings that we had for the investigation of the food and energy nexus and why we need to wean our industrial food systems off of fossil fuels. Our research spanned the global north and the global south. We spoke to over 30 stakeholders in the food and energy sector, cross-cutting different sectors of the field. And we really tried to deep dive into understanding what exactly is happening at the nexus of food and energy. And what we found were 6 key messages. One is that food and energy systems are fundamentally intertwined. When we think about transforming food systems to a more sustainable future, we need to address fossil fuel consumption. And we also won't be able to phase out fossil fuel use if we don't change food systems. So all our goals for net zero, for no emissions, all of that needs to be done through thinking actively about how we're going to transform the food system to be more sustainable. Food systems currently account for at least 15% of global fossil fuel use annually, and this is as many emissions as all of the EU countries and Russia combined. And now when we think of food systems, we know that they're highly industrial and highly energy intensive and dependent on fossil fuels. And when we look at these trends, that intensity of energy use is just continuing to grow. Now, food systems don't just consume energy, but they also produce it in the form of biofuels and biomaterials, such as using corn or soybean to create biofuels, or livestock waste to convert that into biogas and then energy. And also there are some instances of on-farm energy like agrivoltaics, where solar panels are put on farmland as well, and the two kind of uses coexist together. Now, the fossil fuel industry is investing heavily in petrochemicals to lock in dependence on food systems. And what we mean by this is that a lot of the fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemicals we use to grow our agriculture and for agricultural production is actually derivatives of oil and gas. So that's petrochemicals. And with renewable-based energy kind of taking a greater growth in the next few years, the fossil fuel industry is looking more towards investing in petrochemicals to lock in dependence in our agricultural food systems. So thinking about all this and keeping this in mind, we must shift towards an agroecology and regenerative agriculture approaches, think about using more plant-based diets, less processed foods, and more localized value chains to really think about how we can shift our food systems away from fossil fuels. Now, when we say that food and energy systems are fundamentally intertwined, what we mean is that energy is consumed and energy is produced through various stages of the agricultural value chain. So this chart kind of shows you how there are basically 4 stages of the agricultural value chain: input production, land use and agricultural production, processing and packaging, and retail consumption and waste. And all the boxes highlighted in yellow are essentially stages in which energy is consumed, and the boxes highlighted in blue are stages in which energy is produced. So for example, in input production, to produce fertilizers or pesticides, we do need to consume energy to synthesize the raw material, to extract the material needed for these pesticides. In agricultural production stage, there's instances of on-farm energy production, so agrivoltaics, or also the growth of biofuels and biomaterials like soybean or corn crops to create energy. Now, thinking about our industrial food systems, we know that they are very energy intensive and very dependent on fossil fuels, and this is just continuing to grow. There's increased mechanization in the way in which we process and package our food and grow our food. There's a growing use of fossil fuel-based inputs, so fertilizers and pesticides to keep up with food production. Globalized supply chains means that transport is needed, and the more transport is needed, they're typically based on energy that is produced from fossil fuels. There's a growing demand for meat and dairy, and then therefore the implications of the amount of energy needed to grow the feed for meat and dairy, to cultivate them, etc. And then there's also new food trends such as ultra-processed foods and alternative meats. And while on one hand, for example, alternative meats are sustainable in that they kind of may reduce GHG emissions or and are great alternatives, when we think about it in this form of energy intensiveness, we can see that actually lab-grown protein, for example, is 6 times more energy intensive than chicken when you count it per kilogram of meat produced. And I think lastly, thinking about the fossil fuel industry as a whole and how dependent agricultural food systems are on fossil fuel, there are vested interests in maintaining dependence on fossil fuels, so investing into petrochemicals for plastics and agrochemicals. Now, when we think about the interactions between food and energy and the implications that arise from that, we typically think about it in the sense of the environment. Energy is used to produce food, and therefore emissions are created, and that's the main kind of effect or the implication. But actually, having done this research, we see that the implications cross-cut environmental, economic, and social aspects. For example, the use of agricultural lands for energy production, in which farmland is replaced with solar panels. On one hand, this can be really beneficial because it uses residual croplands for energy production, it diversifies the income for farmers, it reduces energy poverty around the area, and it can also facilitate the clean energy transition. But on the other hand, energy companies can typically pay a much higher price per square foot of farmland than local farmers, and therefore they price out farmers from their local lands. There can be infringement of indigenous rights when land is taken away without permission, and it can disrupt local food systems and food security when too much land is converted from food to energy production. And now when we map these negative implications across the value chain, what we see is an interesting trend where a lot of these implications fall under phase 2 and phase 4 of the agricultural value chain. So in land use and agricultural production, and retail and consumption and waste. And actually, it's usually the most vulnerable that are disproportionately impacted. So think people like the urban poor who may not be able to afford food when food prices rise, or farmers who experience a loss in agricultural livelihoods. And these negative impacts compound, right? When the farmer experiences a loss of agricultural livelihoods because energy production has taken over their farmland, this leads to a loss of income and therefore greater insecurity. Now, having spoken to many stakeholders in the industry, we do know that there are a lot of organizations and efforts focused on food and energy so far, right? And we can see that some of them focus on specific parts of the value chain or on specific verticals across the value chain. For example, IRENA and FAO are really looking at reducing energy intensity or shifting to renewable energy across the entire food value chain, where specific organizations like the Clean Cooling Collaborative or the Global Cold Chain Alliance that are looking at creating more renewables-based cold chains so that the energy use for refrigerating food throughout the value chain is not as intensive or bad for the environment. We also have organizations like the WWF that have specific interventions across verticals in each of these phases, like reducing pesticides and input production, agroecological practices, reducing packaging, and reducing food waste. But still, there's a lot more collaboration that needs to exist within the food and energy nexus. And having spoken to many of the stakeholders, we've tried to map out a lot of these opportunities based on opportunity in terms of how many organizations are working on this so far, whether there are scalable interventions that exist, and impact. So is there a lot of impact on a large group of people, potentially a country or regional population? And what we found was that a few key no regrets moves emerged, and that's in the top right-hand quadrant. Now, specifically, these are phasing out fossil fuel-based agrochemicals and transitioning to more regenerative agricultural approaches. So reducing our dependence on agrochemicals like pesticides and fertilizers, and really trying to work with the environment to produce our food. Achieving more healthy, sustainable, and just food environments that really supports plant-rich diets and also less processed foods, because we know how energy intensive those are. Shifting to renewables-based cooling and heating and the drying for agricultural products, and similarly for renewable-based energy for food processing and transportation. Reviewing potential negative externalities and encouraging biogas and biofuel production. So looking at fiscal policies that incentivize this and thinking about whether there are any negative externalities that occur when we incentivize these productions. Tracking and addressing corporate consolidation in the agrochemical and food industry. And overall, just actively supporting a just transition through more inclusive and equitable governance and decision making. I think all this to say that, I mean, our research has been quite extensive, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more we can do in terms of thinking about food and energy as two sectors that have implications on each other and do interact. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Daisy for another audience poll.
Thank you very much for taking us through those findings. So yes, now we have the second poll of this webinar, so it should appear on your screen shortly. The question is, what is the greatest challenge to collaboration between stakeholders focused on food and energy? And their possible choices are lack of awareness of the nexus, lack of clear global vision for food systems transformation, siloed thinking / approaches, differing ideology / priorities, governance structures, or other. So I will give everyone a bit of time to think about their choice, and then we'll look at the results. So I can see the results in front of me now, and I can see that the most popular choices are a lack of clear global vision for food system transformation and siloed thinking, with a lot of people also suggesting differing ideologies / priorities. So that's very interesting to see. We're going to move on now to the moderated panel discussion. So I'm pleased to introduce 3 esteemed guests. First is Michaela Morese, who's Energy Team Leader and Senior Natural Resources Officer at the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Michaela leads the FAO's Programme on Energy Smart Agri-Food Systems, and she has 20 years of experience working on climate change, the environment, and bioenergy. She was formerly Executive Secretary of the Global Bioenergy Partnership at the FAO. Next, we have Avril de Torres, Deputy Executive Director for the Center for Energy, Ecology and Development in the Philippines. Avril leads policy advocacy work and strategic legal interventions for the advancement of transformative energy, ecological justice, and people-centered development. And finally, we have Dr. Sheikh Tanvir Hussain, Director of Policy and Strategy at IFOAM, Organics Asia. Tanvir was formerly Senior Program Officer of the Asian Productivity Organization, Japan, and Senior Scientist at the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute. So I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists some questions. Just to note, if you have any questions of your own at any time, please use the Q&A box and we'll get to them directly afterwards. So my first question is for Michaela. Sustainable energy access in agri-food systems is one of the FAO's priorities. Can you provide an example or two of an initiative and how it has provided both energy security and food security for local communities?
First of all, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So indeed, sustainable energy access in agri-food systems is one of the main priorities of FAO, and there is an extremely important also interconnection to what has been just presented on the report in terms of the importance linkage between energy security, food security, and climate change, and the effects on climate change. A couple of examples, concrete examples. For example, the use of we've been working in Zambia and Rwanda with projects to assess the potential use of current agricultural residues in the two countries, and how these residues could be used for clean cooking solutions. And in this case, we ended up getting as a number in terms of positive effects, the access to clean cooking for smallholders. In Zambia, getting an increase of 12% of access of smallholders to clean cooking solutions, and in Rwanda of about 33%. So it's quite a lot. That's another also example is connected to clean cooking, to cold chain, in particular for smallholders, fishers in Senegal and in other countries. So the importance of reducing food loss and waste in this case is connected to fisheries, and the enormous added value that cold chain could bring. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my second question is for Avril. Which of the insights from the report align with what you are seeing in the Philippines, and how does this linkage impact the well-being of local communities there?
Thank you for the question, Daisy, and thank you for inviting us to join this important discussion. Good day, everyone. For my organization, SEED, we're, I think, the organization that's based in the Philippines, and for the most part, our work has focused on phasing out fossil fuels and advancing transformative energy. But most recently, We've done significant work on oceans and coastal communities, and part and parcel of that work is food systems. So our work is now looking into this nexus of food and energy. And so we very much appreciate the twin reports from Global Alliance for the Future of Food and Dalberg Advisors for putting a spotlight into this nexus on what we think aligns with the context of the Philippines. We definitely agree that for a country like ours, food and energy systems are fundamentally intertwined, and there are interactions across the food value chain. Issues of pesticides and fertilizers and plastics use are very much present in the Philippines. But additionally, and more direct to the work that we do, a nexus that is important to us is the environmental impacts of fossil fuel development in coastal communities and shipping to food systems. So for context, the Philippines is an archipelagic country. We comprise of over 7,000 islands, and we're home to the Verde Island Passage, or VIP. It's the most biodiverse marine habitat in the world, and it's considered as the Amazon of the oceans, comparing it to the Amazon rainforest. So the VIP does not only provide livelihoods and other ecosystem services, but provides food, and it does so for millions of Filipinos. For us, food is very much dependent on seafood. 60% of our protein comes from fish, and fish farming is a centuries-old local tradition in the Philippines. So the protection of marine habitats is an important aspect of food security. Unfortunately, and this is where the nexus comes in, VIP and other marine habitats in the Philippines are hosting shipping routes, which are exposing these habitats to risks of oil spills, maritime accidents, and other environmental impacts. Just take, for instance, the oil spill that happened early this year that leaked over 900,000 liters of industrial oil. And until today, fisher folk in coastal communities are concerned, lamenting that they have no fish to catch, or even if there are fish to catch, are they safe for consumption? And then, of course, something that's of concern is that there's this massive dash for the development of fossil gas power plants and liquefied natural gas, or LNG terminals, in the Verde Island Passage. So 8 gas plants, 8 terminals, and we expect that this massive development will cause significant environmental impacts to the VIP and to food security for millions of Filipinos. So we hope that this spotlight could also be put into, this nexus of food and energy in the Philippines and the threats that we are confronted with today.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear your perspective. So now moving to Tanvir, based on your work at IFOAM Asia, which advocates for organic agriculture, in what ways is fossil fuel dependency locking in an unsustainable and unhealthy food system in your region?
Thank you so much, Daisy. As you know, IFOAM organization actually one of the regional body of IFOAM Organization International, which is actually based in Germany. And we are doing advocacy for the organic agriculture movement in terms of policy, betterment, research and innovation, and market development. So overall, what we see in our experience that fossil fuel actually influence in big way in our current food systems and all through the food system from production to supply chain. And of course, it is a big way to contribute in the wastage as well. And since lot of synthetic fertilizer and pesticides using in the current agriculture systems, and also in your research also you showed in the beginning that the animal products such as meat, dairy, or the processed food, those are actually also largely involved in these food systems. So we believe that organic agriculture can greatly contribute and cope with this situation, because it doesn't allow the energy intensive fossil fuel based fertilizer and synthetic pesticide, and which have a significantly lower carbon footprint. So sustainable food system, more specifically organic farming or any other sustainable system like agroecology or regenerative agriculture, whatever, we feel that those are the right option to move forward to cope with the climate change and contribute a large scale for our reducing the greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Another question now from Michaela. What were the challenges to implementing an integrated approach, and how did you deal with it?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question, because normally we tend to consider that, for example, at the national level, there is a good coordination amongst the relevant stakeholders, but not always this is true. And this is an important part where as soon as we start whatever project in a country at the national level, we start focusing on these specific aspects. So in particular, as soon as we start an activity, a project, we tend to establish a multi-stakeholder working group, which implies, for example, if we are to work on a specific, I don't know, for example, the biogas value chain at the national level from pig manure, just making an example, then we establish a multi-stakeholder working group, including not only government and relevant ministries that are involved in this specific thematic area, but also all the relevant stakeholders. That could be association of producers, association of users, producers of, in this case, could be biogas technologies. So all the relevant stakeholders have to be around the same table in order to make a constructive discussion. So this is extremely important, and not always it's a very immediate issue to be done, in the sense that it takes some time also to raise the awareness at the local, national level on the importance of getting these relevant stakeholders around the table. Just to make an example, a concrete example, a few years ago, 3 years ago, more or less, we were working in sub-Saharan Africa in order to facilitate a dialogue between bioenergy experts and forestry experts, mainly focused on forest landscape restoration. Because, of course, we know that bioenergy has great opportunities for forest landscape restoration, for positive impacts, and vice versa. And you can guess that in a couple of countries, we were intervening in order to do raising awareness activities, and they never had the opportunity, experts of bioenergy and FLR, forestry experts, to sit together around the same table to discuss and realize how much the two aspects, the two thematic areas are interconnected with all the potentials, positive potentials that one could bring to the other, and vice versa. So interconnection, the multi-stakeholder working groups discussions is key and essential. And of course, whatever discussions comes out from these, elements comes out from these discussions, then could be used not only for policymakers in order to guide their policy decisions in order to further improve the sustainability of their energy smart agri-food systems approach at the national level, but also to improve capacity development and training opportunities in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear. So moving on to Avril again, what potential areas for collaboration do you see between advocates for sustainable food systems and those advocating for clean energy transition?
Yes, in the Philippines, there are many areas for collaboration, but we think, given recent developments, a huge and evident potential area for collaboration is the call for protection of the Verde Island Passage, or VIP. It's facing massive threats that have implications to energy and food systems. So threats are not just unsustainable fishing and tourism activities, which are the ones that are most often cited, but now massive fossil gas and LNG development, so more fossil fuels, and also it's an important and major source of food for millions of Filipinos. There is already a campaign called Protect VIP, which SEED is a part of. It's a broad network. It comprises not just of energy transition advocates, but also conservation organizations, academe scientists, and most importantly, fisher folk and coastal communities. But we definitely need more advocates from sustainable food systems to join us and speak their experience and their expertise on the relevance of this campaign to food security and We hope they could bring in their expertise, especially noting some important data about food security in the Philippines. Just for example, the UN reports that nearly 51 million Filipinos are facing moderate or severe food insecurity in 2020 to 2022. So being able to look at this nexus is very important. So we hope that for those who are interested in collaborating, just a little bit of plug, you can visit protectvip.org and learn more, and hopefully we can have this collaboration.
Thank you. And Tanvir again, what are your priority actions to transition industrial agriculture away from fossil fuel dependency?
Yes, before going to the industrial area, actually, I want to share with everyone that all of you know the small-scale farmers are the key in the Asian agriculture, who are actually growing the 1/2 of the total production. So we must have to look and focus on the small-scale farmers, that how they can use their local resources, eco-friendly business entrepreneurships, and by practicing the low carbon practice such as organic agroecology or different our sustainable diets and value chains. So the issue is that before unless we protect our 80% of small-scale farmers, actually we cannot build up our sustainable food systems. And for that, actually, I feeling, of course, we need to use the sustainable farming practices more and more, recycling and the renewable resources. And regarding your question to the transition of the industrial agriculture, I think one of the best way that we have to think of the agriculture transformation system in overall, because when the agriculture actually started, it was started from the manual system to the mechanized system, and now it is many way in the digital system. And the mechanical waste, mechanization, as you know, it is one of the big source of fossil fuel. So probably we need to more think about the digital applications in future for this agriculture transformation system. Of course, but it is not very easy to this transformation in the smart or digital transformation, and it depends on the country's readiness with different digital application availability and their user-friendly techniques or the education of the peoples. But at the same time, if I allow to give one example, since now I am in traveling in Taiwan, and now I'm sitting in Nanhua University Sustainability Center. The center actually has project that by 2028 they make this campus a carbon neutrality campus. So they already started last 3 to 4 years and want to make with a projection that they make the university and the campus is a carbon neutrality. So overall, I believe that we need to have more investment, more discussion on the research and innovation. And for that, we will find the best practices on sustainable farming techniques, which can be more adapted and more usable, not only the industrial agriculture, but most what I want in the small scale farmers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're getting close to the end of this panel. So just a reminder, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put them in the Q&A box. One more question for Michaela. What are the barriers encountered and what changes are needed to the enabling environment to put in practice sustainable agri-food systems and scale them up?
Thank you. Well, a lot has been done and a lot still needs to be done. But of course, if we would have to select a couple of points in terms of what's still needed, I mean, what could make a change, let's say, I would highlight a couple of points. The first one is financing. So as of today, only 3% of international financial institutions and funding is flowing towards energy smart agri-food systems approach, which means that is not enough. I mean, the transformation of the agri-food systems and of how energy is used in agri-food system is so important. Also, if we think about impacts in terms of GHG emissions, that is needing a lot more than 3%. And we know also from IEA scenarios, for example, that in order to be able to achieve the net zero emissions by 2050, we are supposed to triple by 2030 the investments in the sector, up to $4 trillion. So it means that an extra effort has to be done on this specific thematic area. And somehow to facilitate this flowing of investments into this sector could be an extra effort from governments in terms of including into their nationally determined contribution targets, reasonable targets related to energy smart agri-food system approaches. And the achievement of these objectives, of this target into their NDCs would facilitate a flowing of financing opportunities in order to allow them to achieve those targets. So the two are connecting one to the other. So those are two main barriers that could make a change. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now going to move over to the audience Q&A. I can see a question in the Q&A box from Richard Savage. The question is, Australia has in excess of 10 million hectares of dry land wheat, brackets, area depends on growing conditions. How do we harvest this without massive fossil fuel inputs? Michaela, would you like to have a go at answering this question?
Sure. Well, when we face these kind of immediate, let's say, numbers and data, the immediate reaction would be, let's do a feasibility assessment of the potential, because we need to see how is these dry land, the condition of the land, what's needed to the land if it could be restored. So if it's to be restored, for example, then it means that we could think about bioenergy applications like byproducts like organic fertilizers from biogas and therefore digestate to be put into the soil. Or if we think about, for example, we are also thinking about contaminated lands, but that's not the case in this situation. Contaminated lands where through bioenergy potential opportunities could facilitate a restoration of the land on one side, and on the other side also a reduction of the absorption of pollutants. So it really depends on the case. I mean, that's the real one of the real challenge of energy in agri-food systems. It's very context specific. So we need to look at the very context specific situation, do an assessment of potential and evaluate what are the potentials, what are the barriers, challenges and opportunities of each of the options, and go for the best one. So that would be my feedback on this.
Thank you very much. And a second question from Richard is, any idea why governments are so slow to effect policy change that could drive change? Avril, would you like to answer this from the perspective of the Philippines?
I think there are a broad range of causes why governments are slow to effect policy change. In the Philippines, probably something that's most evident is competing interests. For instance, in an energy sector that's deregulated and privatized. And unfortunately, the result has been a huge concentration of market share in just a number of companies. We have these companies being able to dictate what type of projects are proposed, and government having to deal with how do they encourage a faster transition to a genuinely sustainably powered society, and then having those interests overlap with other interests in the agriculture and aquaculture sectors, then it becomes even more complicated. But for our context, having that privatized sector plays into the picture. And then, of course, I think also that understanding of the intersections between these two nexus, and also having a data-driven, scientifically backed study that gives that pathway of what the power sector, for example, or the agricultural sector could take, that pathway that they could take to align to a 1.5 degrees Celsius target under the Paris Agreement. We're happy that for some of these sectors, for instance, in the power sector, we already have an independent study that will be released also soon that looks into a 1.5 aligned pathway, and hopefully that's something that government will listen to and also consider policy recommendations so that we could drive the much needed and overdue change in the Philippines specifically.
And Tanvir, do you have a perspective on this from the countries that you've worked in?
To me, actually, the food and energy is actually very much interrelated, interconnected. You know, you cannot detach one to another, because power or irrigation, everything is dependent on the energy, and that is actually related to the agriculture food production. But many times what I've seen, that there are very weak connection with for the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Energy, and that is very much important, that how to work together for the betterment and the maximum reduction of the fossil fuels. So that is, to me, too much critical, and I like to emphasize on that this connection is very important between the national ministries, so that it will be more better use of the resources.
Thank you. We've got another question from Chris G. What do you think is the most powerful finding in this research that has potential co-benefits across food and energy, and most likely to see energy campaigners want to join efforts with sustainable food campaigners? I think everyone would have a perspective on this. So shall we start with Michaela and then go round? Thank you.
I would highlight a couple of points. The first one is really raising awareness. Because, for example, in the case of bioenergy, after 20 years that I've been focusing on bioenergy, there is still a lot of resistance regarding the opportunities. Of course, we are keenly aware that bioenergy, as any other source of energy, that could be solar, wind, and others, have challenges and opportunities. So the key is to focus on sustainability and make sure that to take out the best from the opportunities. That these, in this case, it's bioenergy, could bring. So raising awareness and a very transparent dialogue at all levels with all relevant stakeholders is essential. And so this is one important point. In terms of what are the most powerful findings regarding the links between energy and agriculture, is really the opportunities that these energy smart agri-food system approaches could bring to the local population. As in the case of Zambia and Rwanda that I mentioned, access to more huge numbers, percentage of population accessing clean cooking solutions, or reduction of GHG emission that would imply also indoor air pollution issue that has negative, terrible impacts in terms of health, respiratory diseases that could be avoided, and therefore a welfare for the local population. So the main attention from my side is to look at the added value that these solutions could bring to the local population. Green jobs, you name the opportunities that these could bring. So this is really key and important. Thank you.
Thank you. Avril, what's your perspective on this?
I agree with Michaela that just raising awareness is already a hugely significant contribution. It puts a spotlight on an issue that's most often not tackled, and we don't see a lot of collaboration between energy and food, sustainable food system advocates in the Philippines, something that we found very powerful in the report, as well as this discussion, and how we cannot transform food systems without addressing fossil fuel consumption, and vice versa. We can't talk about fossil fuel phase out without changing food systems. And we definitely agree with this, and hope that this means when we try to do our work, we find ways on how to collaborate. I think something also that I would want to highlight is the discussion on how one of the co-benefits would be in transforming food systems is enhancing food security, something that is very much a problem in the Philippines right now, not just with the way food systems are the food systems are structured in the Philippines, but also with worsening impacts of climate change. So I think that's an additional reason for us to look into this and to collaborate.
Thank you. And Tanvir?
Yes, I agree with Michelle, what she said, that we need to think about the localized system, and as in your research also showed that 70% of energy actually consumed in the transportation, processing, shipping, this portion. And if we can make more short supply chain, and actually in organic agriculture, we also support this shorter supply chain for supplying the foods, and which will be reduce your cooling system, the refrigeration, and all through it will reduce the fossil fuel use in all through the packaging and the processing system. So localized and very much short supply chain is very much useful, not only the bring the better food system, also in the industrial agriculture as well. It will be very much useful.
Thank you. We've got another question from Richard, which is, we have seen significant increases in agrochemicals over the last 24 months. This is reducing margins for farmers and for many is a threat to sustain food production. Surely this is a reason to drive a shift to regenerative agriculture away from fossil fuel produced agrochemicals. Is there anyone that would like to comment on this question? Go for it.
Yeah, just a consideration that, of course, bioenergy, renewable energies are, as applied to agri-food systems, are within a broader bioeconomy context. And sustainability is key also when we think about energy in agriculture, but also when we think about energy in agriculture in a context, in a wider context in a bioeconomy context. And why I'm saying this, because sustainability and in terms of performances under the environmental, social, and economic point of view, it's the only, an assessment through this is the only way to see what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and how to adjust, the value chain in a way that the equilibrium, the balance amongst the environmental, social, and economic aspects are well balanced. So this is essential within the energy in the agri-food system, and considering beyond that in terms of bioeconomy aspects. I guess the question was in that direction. I hope I replied to his question. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. We've got a question here from Zakir, who's from Farmers Voice Bangladesh. And the question is around the issue of food transformation potentially leading to fossil fuel machinery being dumped or passed over to developing countries, and how this could become a major issue as the transition continues. I don't know if anyone's got any comments or thoughts on this. Maybe Avril, you have some comments on this one.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Daisy, but if it concerns how do we raise issues of more fossil fuels coming into developing countries, something that has shown effective in our work is being able to present data-backed reports and studies of how a system that is backed by renewable energy is not only better, but is feasible. I think a lot of the concerns from policymakers is whether a faster transition using sustainably powered technologies is possible and would not increase costs for ordinary people. And having independent organizations come up with those studies and present a feasible pathway has proven to us to be effective in advocating for a just energy transition, not just in the power sector, but in other sectors as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that does address the issue of fossil fuels and being used in developing countries as developed countries move away from using them themselves. So yeah, thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I think we've got time for one more question. So just to read it out here from Karina David. I'm an organic farmer in Brazil and I work with agroforestry, a process agriculture rather than an input agriculture, but the processes aren't paid for, let alone recognized as something of value. But in order to have more people practicing this type of agriculture, we need to value this work. How do you see the possibilities of valuing process farmers without practicing greenwash? Is there anyone that would like to jump in on this one?
If I allow,
Yeah.
actually, obviously, if I say that since the farmers are providing you the good and safe and hygiene food, why not they expect some premiums for their that price? So obviously that is their demand, and not only demand, it is the consumer duty to fulfill for this better food. At the same time, I like to say that since organic agriculture, organic farming, it is a labor-intensive practice, but we need to also reduce the cost of production, and so that it can be very much comparable to the conventional system. And because it's an integrated farming system, and if we can produce different type of products in the same farmlands, so the overall productivity is not actually less compared to the conventional system. So I want to see in the both way that obviously as a consumer point of we should support those farmers who are really producing the good food for us. At the same time, the farmers' perspective also, we need to have the comparable and the more productive land, which can be compensated with the conventional system. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. We're going to have to move on from the Q&A now, but it was great to have so many interesting questions, and we're going to see if our panelists can answer them either with the chatbot function or later on from this webinar. So thank you. Your questions won't be missed, don't worry. So we're going to move on now to our final speaker, who is Teresa Anderson, the Global Lead on Climate Justice for ActionAid International, a federation of more than 45 country offices working on climate and economic justice and humanitarian response. Teresa coordinates the Agricultural Working Group for Climate Action Network and has written dozens of publications about climate change and agricultural issues, including the recent ActionAid report, How the Finance Flows, the Banks Fueling the Climate Crisis. Teresa, you've recently launched a Fund Our Future campaign at ActionAid. How do they relate with our food system's reliance on fossil fuels? What are the opportunities to act or amplify this message, particularly at COP28 and beyond? Are there any aspects or areas that you believe have been overlooked or need more attention? Thank you.
Thanks, Daisy, and thanks to all the speakers. That's been amazing. Well, everyone does know that fossil fuels are the biggest cause of the climate crisis, but far fewer people, as this report shows, understand that agriculture, particularly industrial agriculture, is the second biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions. And we feel, along with many of the other speakers here, that it is time to put industrialized agriculture, fossil fueled farming in the climate spotlight where it belongs. Industrial agriculture has just been getting a free ride in the climate story, and the fossil fuel companies know this. They see the market opportunity. They see that pushing industrial agriculture into new markets in the global south is a way for both industrial agriculture corporations and fossil corporations to keep expanding. So they are working hand in hand very deliberately on this. And both of these industries are disrupting weather patterns, causing droughts, floods, cyclones, erratic rainfall patterns, rising sea levels, all these trends that are harming communities in the global south, those who are most vulnerable to climate change, especially marginalized people living in poverty, especially women. And we also know that it is agroecology that the way to produce food by working with nature instead of against it is a far more effective solution for both adaptation and mitigation. And agroecology can feed the world. It already does. 70%, in fact, what is not commonly known, 70% of food consumed by people is actually grown on smallholder farms, largely using agroecological techniques. But these farms use just 25% of the world's farmlands. And in fact, agroecology is a far more efficient way of feeding people than industrialized plantation farming, which is mostly producing commodity crops for export or animal feed for the industrialized food system. So there is massive scope to scale up the use of agroecology and really feed the world using it. And the role of fossil fuels in agriculture has really hit communities dependent on fertilizers very hard in the last couple of years following the Ukraine war because of the huge price hikes in fertilizer following the rise in fossil fuel prices. In Southern Africa, some governments have actually been using between 30 and 70% of their national agriculture budgets on subsidizing fertilizers. It's ridiculous. And as these prices have risen, these subsidies, these government finances just are going less and less far. So now really is the time to move to agroecology. This saves farmers money, it saves governments money, and it just makes so much sense to use government resources to invest in gender responsive agroecological training, of course, really targeting women farmers who are so often rendered invisible by policy, but are actually, feeding the world, and indeed make up half of the farmers in the global south. So what are we doing about this as ActionAid? We've been looking increasingly into how the world's money flows are fueling the climate crisis, because even as we do all this work to change policy, very important work, in practice, the way that the money is flowing is continuing to fuel this climate crisis and is often contradicting policy. I think Michaela even referred to that as well. So we need to make the money flows align with the policy direction. And we need public funds, subsidies, and private finance, including how banks are providing their loans and underwriting, to really address this. The Paris Agreement in 2015 called to make finance flows consistent with a pathway to low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So we've been looking into how that's going, and spoiler alert, it's not going very well. Our research published a couple months ago in our report, How the Finance Flows, showed that in the 7 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, bank financing provided to the largest industrial agriculture corporations operating in the global south came to £370 million. And to the fossil fuel companies, it was 3.2 trillion. And if you average out that numbers, it actually shows that 20 times more financing to fossil fuels and industrial agriculture has gone to the global south every year compared to climate finance, going to countries to address the climate crisis. So the money is flowing in the wrong direction. So we've launched our Fund Our Future campaign because we want to see the public and private finance flows, the trillions of dollars that do make the world go round, being put to protecting the planet and making the earth safe for many generations to come. And we have recommendations to governments, we have recommendations to banks. At COP28, there's also a role to strengthen the implementation of that Article 2.1c, that one about aligning financial flows. So that's why we're calling attention to the role of industrial agriculture and its connection to fossil fuels, and calling to stop private finance from doing harm and making private finance do good. Because if we want a future, we do have to fund our future.
Thank you so much for that. We've just got a very short time for a final poll and some final remarks from Patty. So hopefully the poll is going to appear in front of you now, and I'll hand over to Patty to give her final remarks. Thank
you, Daisy. It's been so fascinating. And And I've learned a lot from all the panelists who've spoken today. So I really want to thank all of you, the moderator, and for all of your great questions that really helped us to kind of dive deeper into the issues as well as to some of the solutions. I won't repeat because we don't have time. Some of the kind of the summarize what's been said by the panelists. So maybe just to kind of finalize that, as we head into COP28, we will continue to draw on this attention around the food and energy nexus. And if you're going to attend in person, come find us. We'll be there. Viv and I will both be at COP28. Many of our sessions will also be hybrid. They'll be online, and we'll be posting a list of all the events that we'll be participating in on our website. In addition, we're sponsoring 42 frontline food and farming leaders to attend COP28. Some of them are actually on this call, or our panelists, so you can also find them in person there. And they'll be available for media interviews to share their perspective. So thank you again for being part of the discussion today. Your insights have been incredibly valuable, and you'll be helping, this will be helping us to shape our strategies for 2024 and beyond. Thank you. And back to you, Daisy, for the final poll results.
Thank you. Yes, so just very quickly looking, it looks like the most popular choice for which of the report's recommendations would you like to explore? The most popular choice is phasing out synthetic agrochemicals and accelerate the uptake of agroecology and regenerative agriculture. So very much mirroring a lot of the things we've been speaking about in this hour. But yes, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And thank you to all the panelists that appeared, and to Teresa for her final remarks. And thanks for listening to me as well. So bye, have a great day, everyone.